Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. This is Kalve Abbas and I am here with another lecture on strategic management. As you know that in the previous class we have started our discussion on implementation of these strategies. And we have also discussed that what are the problems that managers and the top management face when they are into the implementation strategies. In today's lecture, we would expand on that very discussion. We would be discussing that what are some of the managerial issues that the management face when they are shifting from the planning phase into the implementation phase. So I'm very confident that after listening to my today's lecture, you would be able to discuss in detail all the managerial issues related to the implementation of this strategy. We would be also discussing that how the annual goals impact the overall implementation strategies of the organization. We would also be discussing that what is the role of policies and what is the how policies. We would also be discussing that what is the role of policies and how they impact the efficiency and effectiveness of the implementation process. And at the end, we would be discussing that how we can allocate the resources depending on the discussions that we have done in the planning phase. So I'm very confident after listening to my today's lecture, you would be able to learn all of these objectives that I have recently mentioned. So as we have discussed in the previous classes, that the planning phase is completed. In the planning phase, we have not only gathered data regarding the environment in which the organization is working, we have also gathered information about the internal factors of the organization. And we have used that information to not only find out that what is the best strategic options that we have not only used that to find out what are all the strategic options that we have also used this information to find out the exact strategy that suits our external environments and internal strengths and weaknesses of the organization. And now is the time to implement those strategies and to implement those decisions that we have made in our previous slides and in the discussion phase of the previous chapters. So we are going to shift from strategy formulation towards strategic implementation. But strategic formulation and implementation. But this shift now requires that we need to understand that what are the changes that we are going to expect, not only how the management is going to work, but also how functional managers are going to perform. Because when we were talking about strategic formulations, mostly the focus was on positioning all of our forces. But now in the implementation phase, the focus would be to manage those forces during the action or during the implementation. During the strategy formulation, we were more focused on effectiveness, but now the focus would shift toward efficiency and how we are going to achieve whatever we have decided. In this strategic formulation, the primary goal was to have a very intellectually. During this strategic formulation, the goal was to have an intellectually stimulating debates, but now the complete focus is going to be on the implementation and taking actions on those intellectual discussions that we had. In strategic formulation, what was required? A good intuition and a good data was required. But now, in this strategic formulation, what manager requires? Manager requires, in strategic formulation, intuition and good analytical skills were required. But now in the implementation phase, the manager requires to motivate and she should have that leadership skills. So what the manager is going to do and the skill sets that are required both in strategic formulation phase and implementation phase also vary a lot. More importantly, while we were formulating this strategy, coordination among few peoples were required, because as I've told you before, that strategy is always formulated at the top, and best people from all the departments are selected to do the brainstorming on where the organization is going to head in future. But in case of strategic implementation, now the entire organization is needed to be involved in this strategic formulation, because as we have discussed in the previous slides as well, that a good strategy cannot be implemented if everyone is not playing their part and if every department is not contributing towards strategic implementation of the organizations. So as we have discussed in the previous slide, that the shift from strategic formulation to strategic implementations requires different shifts, not only in the skill sets, in the overall objectives of what we are going to do, but also in the responsibility as well. Now the responsibility has been shifted from the strategists to the departmental and functional managers, because they are the one who are going to implement this strategy. Here, I would remind you that in the very first chapters, we have discussed that the complete strategic management process is not a paper process, it is a people process. So here lots of people are going to be involved, and if they do not know that what they are going to do, and if they do not know that what they are going to do and what is expected from them, then they would never be able to implement these strategies in a very efficient way. So as I have told you in the very beginning of my lecture, that today our focus is going to be the managerial issues that are central to this strategic implementation. And in this very chapter, we would be discussing that how establishing annual objectives have an impact on the strategic implementation. How we are going to formulate the policies, allocate resources, alter the existing organizational culture, restructure and re-engineer the complete procedures and policies, revise, reward and incentivize the policies. We would also be discussing that how we can minimize the resistance to change, how we can match managers to the strategies and the skill sets that we require. We would also be discussing that how we can develop a strategy that is not only coherent or in sync and consistent with the overall organizational culture. We also need to learn that how we can adapt to improve the productivity, how we can develop an effective human resource functions, is downsizing is required, and how the performance is linked to pay and strategies. So in this very chapter, we would be touching upon all of these points that I have just mentioned. In this very lecture, we would just be focusing on the annual objectives, how we can formulate policies and what policies actually are, and how we can effectively allocate resources. So first of all, let's talk about annual objectives. As we have discussed in the previous classes as well, that annual objectives basically provide the right direction that where the organization is actually heading. And we can break down our long-term plans into annual objectives or annual plans. These annual objectives actually also serve as a basis for resource allocation, because we would be having very clear idea that what are the departments we would be focusing on, what are the activities that we want to conduct, and what are all the resources that we require in order to perform those activities. Then these annual objectives also act as a mechanisms for management to evaluate the performance of all the individuals that are part of that particular department or those activities. Because as I have told you in my previous class, that your objective has absolutely no clarity if there is no measure to evaluate the performance of the people who are going to achieve those very objectives. So that is why the annual objective would act as a mechanism to evaluate the performance of the people that are working on those activities and on those objectives. Then annual objective also work as a major instruments for monitoring the progress toward achieving the long-term objective. As I have told you that you can break down your long-term objectives into smaller annual objectives, and if you are not achieving the annual objectives, you can say this for sure that you are going nowhere in direction of your annual objectives or your long-term objectives. For example, if a retail organization has a long-term objective of opening up 500 retail stores in Pakistan, and it has broken down all of those objectives into annual objective of opening 100 stores every year, and that organization has not achieved that for last 2 years, then the organization can say for sure that in next 5 years it would never be able to achieve its long-term goals, because it has not achieved the annual objectives at the very first place. So the annual objective gives us a very clear idea that whether we are heading toward the direction of our long-term objectives or long-term strategies or not. Then the annual objective also help organizations to establish priorities. As we have discussed in the previous slides, that good organizations where the strategy is given priority, there the resources are being allocated on the basis of this strategy. Every organization has limited resources, and we have discussed that in our previous chapters as well, that every organization with its limited resources wants to have the most efficient allocation of these resources. If there is no unified direction, every department would like the organization to give that particular department more and more resources. But if we have prioritized that where we are moving, and if we know that what are the areas where we are weak and what are our strengths and how we can further consolidate on our strengths, then we know that where we can get the most out of by allocating the resources. So the annual objectives gives us a very clear idea that what is our priority and where we are heading in terms of the long-term objectives of the organization, and how resource allocations can help us out. So as you can see right in front of you is a very good example of how organization can break down its long-term objectives into divisional annual objectives, and then every division and department can further break down all the annual objectives so that each and every team member has a very clear idea that what they are going to achieve. As you can see that the long-term objective of the company here is to develop or to increase the revenue that it is producing. Then it has divided that particular objective into 3 divisions. Division A has an objective to increase the overall revenue or the sales by 40%. Then taking that objective into account, that division or the department has further divided the annual goals or annual objectives into departmental team objectives. They have divided into R&D, production, marketing, finance, and overall procurement departments. As you can see in the R&D, they have made a policy, or they have given this objective to R&D that they need to develop at least 2 new products every year, and the marketing team has this objective that they have to increase the sales team by 40%. So this is how you can see that all the objectives are not only consistent vertically, they are also consistent horizontally. As you can see that the consistency of the annual objectives is also very important, as we have discussed in the previous slides as well. The horizontal consistency basically means that all the department-wise objectives should be consistent to one another. For example, if you have given the marketing team this objective that they have to increase their sales by 40%, then the production team has to increase their production with 40% as well. So if you have not given this objective to the production department to increase the efficiency or the overall quantity of what they are going to produce, and yet you have given this objective or to the marketing department to increase their sales, then this means that both of these objectives are not horizontally consistent. Because we call it horizontal consistent because management department, we are calling it horizontally consistent objectives because the marketing department and the production department comes in at the same level. We are calling it horizontally consistent departments because we are talking about the marketing and the production departments of the same division. On the other hand, the divisional annual objectives should also be consistent. If one division is given an objective of increased revenue by 30%, then other divisions should also be given the objectives that are very consistent to that very division. You cannot simply ignore one particular department and keep on focusing on other departments because, as I have discussed before, that the growth and the strategic implementation for any organization depends on depends on all the departments that are working on the organization rather than just one department. As we have discussed in the previous slides, that annual objectives play a very vital role when it comes to deciding upon that where the organization is heading, what are the resource allocation priorities, and how the people or how the performance of the annual objectives are going to be evaluated. That is why in the previous class we have also discussed the SMART methodology of deciding upon the goals and objectives that the organization is going to achieve. I'm not going to recap it. I'm just going to let you know that the SMART objective means that your objectives should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And most importantly, organization should be focusing on statements like, this means that organization should have a very clear objective. It doesn't matter that for what particular department or for what particular division or at which particular level you are making the objectives. If your objectives are going to use such statements like to increase or to improve the revenue or to increase the overall productivity, you are giving a very unclear objective to the people to work upon. So we should be avoiding such statements. Instead, we should be using more and more numbers. Rather than saying that we need to increase our revenue, we should be saying that we need to increase the revenues by 20% in the next quarter, which means that we are not only mentioning that what is the percentage of increase we want, we are also mentioning the timeline within which we need to achieve that objective, which makes the overall objective statement very clear to the people who are going to, which makes this annual objective very clear to the people who are going to implement that very strategy. Another very important thing that strategists should be keeping in mind is that your annual objective should state the quantities, the quality, the cost, and the time. As we have discussed in the previous classes, your annual objective should be specific, it should be measurable, attainable, relevant to the organizational overall objectives, and time bound. All of these characteristics are found in a well-written organization's annual objectives. Another thing that you should be keeping in mind while we are designing the annual objectives is that the focus should be more on the quality and improvement rather than on the quantity. Rather than trying to do too many things, we should be focusing on that particular priority that we believe would be having highest contribution toward the overall achievement or the overall growth of the organization. On the other hand, it is also very important that organization must tie rewards and it must recognize the achievement of the people that are working on the most critical and the most important tasks that are related to the annual objectives, because it creates an extra bit of kick and motivation for the people who are working on the activities that are crucial to the success of the organization. So now let's talk about the policies. As I've mentioned that all these annual objectives, they are not going to get implemented on their own. We need to change the firm overall structure, we need to change the firm's overall direction, and we need to monitor that change on the daily basis. And for that, we need to have new policies. Now, what is meant by policy? Policies are basically boundaries, constraints, and limits on the kind of administrative actions that can be taken and the reward that is attached to that particular effort. Now, what are policies? Policies basically define boundaries, limitations, constraints within which the managers have to work, and managers can actually expect what is demanded from them and how they are going to be rewarded if they are going to achieve that very thing. Every organization have these policies. For example, quite recently, University of South Asia has introduced work from home policy. This work from home policy does not only identifies that what we are supposed to do, it also identifies that how the reward system would work and how we would be evaluated. Now, every organization have these kind of policies. I can give you many examples. For example, many of the organizations have corporate leave policy. Again, if I can give the example of USA, in USA we have this policy that every faculty member is entitled to 12 sick leaves and 12 casual leaves. This means that any faculty member that is going beyond these leave criteria, this means that all the faculty members that are going beyond this leave quota are going to be penalized, or they would miss some of the rewards that are associated with the leave and with the leave applications. More than 40% of the organizations, they do not have any policy on how the internet is going to be used in an organization. But I have personally observed that another example can be that many of the organizations do not have a very clear strategy that how the internet can be used within the organization. But now there are lots of softwares that are present which can not only tell you that how the employees are using the internet, but now there are softwares that can tell us that how the internet is being used within the organization and whether the employees are using the internet in an efficient way or not, and whether the people are using internet for the efficiency in their work or they are just surfing the web for their personal pleasure or for their personal tasks. So now the policy even on the use of internet in the organization is also evolving with the passage of time, and many organizations have different policies as well. I can give you many other examples as well. For example, Walmart have this policy that every customer can find help within the 10 feet, which is very consistent to the business model that Walmart is following. Because Walmart is operating huge retail outlets, it is very important for the customers to find immediate help. If the customer has to wander around or he is unable to find help in the close vicinity, it would be a total waste of his time, and probably a very potential sales can be missed. So that is why Walmart has increased the total number of helpers and total number of operators within a certain retail outlet, which can help the customers on a ready basis. This policy was hugely welcomed in Japan because traditionally in Japanese culture, the retail outlets were very smaller in size. But Walmart with this policy tried to give the same experience, the same helping environment even in large scale outlets as well. Then we can develop policies that are very specific to certain departments. For example, many of the organizations, human resource departments, they have equal opportunity policy, which means that regardless of your race, your religion, you would be given equal opportunity of employment if you qualify a certain merit or certain qualification criteria. So we can make policies that are departmental wise, and we can also make policies that are applied to the complete organization. So right in front of you is a very good example of how you can break down the policies and how you can represent the departmental policies to the overall organizational policy. Here again, you should be using this opportunity to break down the annual objectives using your policies into departmental and functional objectives. As you can see that the company's objectives is to acquire a chain of retail outlets to meet the sales growth and profitability objectives. Now this objective can be met with the policies that are consistent to this very objective. So the supporting policies can actually look like that all the stores would be open from 8 to 8 p.m. from Monday to Saturday. This policy can actually help out that particular retail outlet by increasing the overall revenues and increasing the footfall within that retail outlet. Then another supporting policy can be that all the stores must submit a monthly control data report. This policy can also reduce the expense to sales ratio within that organization. Another supporting policy can be from beginning of January 2010, every employee will have the option of working up to 20 hours of overtime per week. Now this policy could minimize the need of additional contractual employees that the retail outlet need in order to run efficiently. Now all of these policies are consistent with the strategy that this organization wants to implement. This is the basic role of the policy. Policy defines that how the managers and how all the functional and operational people, this is the role of the policy. Policy basically defines that how all the employees, all the staff members, the functional managers are going to act, what are their limitations, what are their responsibilities, and what is expected from them in order to achieve the strategy of the organization. So as we have discussed, that policy plays a very vital role in defining that what is required from each and every individual within the organization. Now let's talk about resource allocation. Now resource allocation is central to the managerial activity that allows the organization to implement its strategy. Such organizations where resource allocation is not done according to this strategy, there generally resource allocation is done on the basis of either politics or personal liking, disliking. As I've mentioned many times before, that every organization has limited resources. So if you are not allocating resources without any strategy, you are basically wasting those resources that could have been used more efficiently and effectively in order to achieve the long-term objectives. So the strategic management basically enables the top management to identify that where the resources are required the most and what should be the priority of the organization. And nothing could be more detrimental to the strategic management process if the resources are not allocated according to the decisions and according to the prioritized plans and strategies that we have formulated. For example, if an organization has selected market development as the basic strategy that it is going to follow, then the organization must allocate some of the resources in understanding the markets in which it is going to operate. If an organization has not allocated any of these resources toward the R&D or toward understanding new markets, then there is no point of selecting a strategy. This strategy would not be implemented on its own. You need to have supporting policies, and then you need to allocate resources accordingly in order to implement these strategies. So as we have discussed this before as well, that generally organizations have 4 different types of resources. We have financial resources, physical resources, human resources, and technological resources. If you want to further understand that what is meant by all of these resources, I want you to recap and go back and listen to my lecture on the resource-based view of the organization, in which we have very thoroughly and in detail discussed all these different types of resources. So why generally organization fails to allocate resources according to these strategies? According to Yavitt and Newman, they have done a research and they explained that why organizations many times fail. They say that most of the times managers normally have many tasks that they can do. and managers must allocate time and resources among these tasks. Because of the pressure that builds up, expenses are too high, the CEO wants the good financial report for the third quarter, strategic formulation and implementation activities often get deferred. And because of that, the problems they soak up and the available energies and the resources, they scramble under the pressure. So in most of the organizations, the focus is too much on the operational tasks that the strategies and the strategic implementation, it goes into the background. So according to Yavitz and Newman, the basic reason that why organizations fail to allocate resources according to this strategy is that in most of the cases, organizations are too much focused on the operational issues that the organization is facing on a daily basis, that they lose the sight of the long-term vision that the organization has. So the core value of every resource allocation lies in the accomplishment of the long-term objectives that we want to achieve. Every effective resource allocation strategy does not guarantee that we are going to achieve our long-term objectives, but it provides a basis for all the personnels, the programs, and the top management to allocate the resources in the right directions. Now, just to conclude, that resource allocation is one of the most debated issues when it comes to strategic implementation, because in the organization, everyone would be fighting for all the resources for their own departments and for their own working. So the top management should have a very clear vision that where they want to take a certain organization, and according to that, they should be allocating the resources. This brings me to the end of my today's lecture. In this lecture, we have learned what are some of the major managerial issues that we need to resolve and that can help us smoothen out the process of implementation of these strategies. We have also discussed that how the setting of annual objectives play a vital role in the implementation process. We have also discussed that how policies play a very important role in the implementation of the annual objectives. And at the end, we have discussed that what is the resource allocation and how we can use the resource allocation in an efficient way that can help us in implementation of these strategies in the longer run. In the next lecture, we would discuss that how we can alter the overall organization structure, how we can do the re-engineering within the organization, and how we can revise the overall incentive plans to better implement the strategies that we have formulated. Till then, I want you to take very good care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.